because we have a lot of people that watch these back. So if they're not able to attend it live, they usually watch it back. And so these will also be available too if you would like to rewatch them. And I always put them on our YouTube channel and I will email out the recording tomorrow. So we will get started for tonight. This is our last teaching session in our series of five. And tonight's topic is going to discuss second language acquisition and immersion, and really understanding what each means for the future of Oneida language revitalization. And this is really a really integrative discourse and dialogue about understanding two different methods of language acquisition and what that means for a community, understanding the state of the language. So like I mentioned, this is our last teach-in series. Our teach-in series is brought to you all by Scotney Gullett, which is a local 501c3 nonprofit in the Oneida community and in the Green Bay area. And we are Oneida Women's founded organization, and we seek to restore community wellness through Oneida language and culture education, outreach, and advocacy. And so this teaching series is really to support that effort and the mission of Scotney Gullett. And if you've attended the teach-ins before, you'll know who I am, but I'll reintroduce myself again here. So my name is Rosa King. I am the executive director at Scotney Gullett, and I'm also the teacher in our Language Nest program. And so this is kind of my area of expertise, I guess you could say, is understanding second language acquisition and immersion. Last week's, or the week before, sorry, 2 weeks ago, the teach-in series was discussing proficiency and fluency. And so all of these are considerations for Indigenous language reclamation in a community. And it's really important to understand how all of these factors are present in language efforts in a community. It guides us to where we want to go and see our future and a thriving language in our community, but it helps us to understand the historical context, how we got here, and how we can shape programming for our current generation, but future generations that have yet to come. Um, so these factors are really important in understanding language because they address a lot of different things in terms of identity, in terms of healing, understanding history. And so there's so much more to just learning language content. And this gives us a really sound picture of the story of language. So I'm going to get started here. I know sometimes people kind of start popping in throughout the next several minutes at the beginning. So I'll just continue on as we move through tonight's teach-in. So again, welcome. I'm so glad you're all able to join me for the last teach-in. I'm so excited. I love doing this series. It's really, I guess, a passion of mine, but it's really near and dear to my heart in the language journey of our community. And so I love sharing this information with people in a really critical lens and understanding all the factors and nuances that affect language and language reclamation in a community. So, Suguli, welcome. I'm so glad you were all able to join. I do hope we will continue more teaching series in the future, perhaps in the spring or for sure in the summer. And I'm just going to continue to build on these topics and share them with community. So if there's ever a topic that you want to learn about or explore, you can feel free to respond to the emails that I send you all if you registered, or even drop them in the chat. Totally would love to hear your thoughts on other areas that you would like Scotney Gullett to share about, information to share about with you all. Okay, so as always, framing this fire of our teaching series, and to kind of ground ourselves and open our minds to all of this information and knowledge that I'll share with you tonight so that we can kind of reflect and think about in terms of how does that show up for us, but how does that show up for our community? So to kind of ground ourselves and to frame the fire, we want to acknowledge this cultural metaphor of Yungwa Jistai. And so I mentioned that that means our fire, our spirit. It's like this power, this life force within us, within each of us, and that this includes four logs. And so in our cultural practices, they say that these four logs are these four things: consciousness, concatenation, creativity, and curiosity. And that these are necessary to kindle throughout the duration of our lives. To maintain a strong fire. And when we say strong fire, we also mean wellness, to maintain the balance of ourselves in existence and in relationship to all of creation. So that means the balance and wellness and relationship between ourselves and our families, ourselves and our clans and our nation and our community, ourselves and creation, and ourselves and all of the universe. So that was that web of relationality that I talked about during the first two teaching series. And so this is really important for us to maintain those relationships, that sense of wellness. And so we really seek to tend to these four inherent logs that we're born with as a way to strengthen our fires. And so just a refresher, if you want to reflect on which log that you're going to tend to today, you can drop that into the chat while I just briefly kind of renew our understandings of each of these four logs. So feel free to share that while I um, go over those. So consciousness is to be aware of our motives. Concatenation is to understand the link with all beings and phenomena. So all of these logs are also connected to each other in a similar way, especially through the log of concatenation. Creativity is to make these connections in a mutually beneficial way. And so this also acknowledges that there is relationships that exist. They are the foundation of our lives and that we're not individual or separate or disconnected from everything else that exists in creation and in the universe, but instead we are inherently linked and connected, and that we understand the importance of those connections and the relationships. And also that these relationships are based on this idea of giving and receiving. And so to maintain a balance of relationality between ourselves and creation, or ourselves and our families and our clans and our nations, it means that there's this mutually beneficial relationship. So it's kind of like an equal or balanced idea of giving and receiving. And then the last one is curiosity. And so being open to the discovery of others, of new ideas, of new knowledge. And so it's kind of also this idea of openness. You can kind of understand it in that same way. So I'll go ahead and just, if anyone shared in the chat, I'll read that off, but I'll share kind of my log that I am, I guess, tending to tonight. And so I think the log that I'm going to really focus on tonight is consciousness, really being aware of the context and the intentions of language work that's happening in the community, because not only does this help us understand our history and how we got here, but it frames the pathway and the trajectory of where we're going in our community. It gives us important understandings, important considerations that we really need to take into consideration. So it looks like concatenation was one that was shared, consciousness was another. And so if you want to continue to reflect on the log that you are attending to tonight, um, feel free to do that throughout the teach-in tonight. Okay, so community agreements. I know I go over these every time, but it's so important that we renew them every time we share space together, every time we come together. This is a really important practice we have in our ceremonial ways, where we give thanks to everything in creation, where we renew our commitments to each other and to creation. And so the community agreements kind of serve as that similar practice. Oftentimes we do this to remind ourselves of those things, because in our cultural ways, they say creator knows and made humans, they're not perfect individuals. And so we often need to be reminded. And so that's a cultural understanding we have. And that just gives us a better understanding about our own humanity and also how we show up in our relationships, in our shared spaces for each other, our families, our clans, and our community, and so on. So our community agreements, again, are really this idea of active listening, listening to understand, to reflect, absorb, as opposed to responding. And also being curious. That was one of our logs here. Asking questions, deeply reflecting, thinking about things. And so sometimes that means that we don't always have a response right away, and that's okay. We instead want to really harness that idea of reflection, of dialogue, but from a place that is seeking to understand, seeking curiosity. And so we also want to speak from our own experience and use I statements as opposed to generalization saying we or us, because we want to be able to speak from ourselves. And we also want to respect confidentiality, practice both and acknowledging and embracing that there is a coexistence of multiple perspectives, ideas, and experiences, especially in regards to a lot of these topics that we talk about in the teaching series with language or previous ones that we talked about with blood quantum and things like that. And so we want to also understand our intention versus our impact. So the way that we show up and how we are in relation to our families, our clans, community, and the universe and creation, there is intentions that we have for that, but there's also sometimes an impact. So we need to also be mindful of how both of those exist. Um, Being a good relative and ensuring our right to safety, which is really embodying our cultural values of peace, strength, and a good mind, or harmony, honesty, and practicing those 4 R's in action. So that includes respect, relationships, reciprocity, and responsibility. And we also want to remind ourselves why we're here. And so that's a good purpose for this community, revisiting community agreements, because we want to stay mission driven. We want to learn, we want to integrate, we want to reflect on these topics and focus on community and collaboration towards shared goals because we're actually much stronger together when we do that. And also acknowledge the power of the parking lot because a lot of these topics can be a lot. They're probably new, or maybe they're a deeper understanding of things you might be familiar with. Maybe they present more questions or more reflection. And so sometimes we take that time to reflect and we can also kind of put it in the parking lot. We can allow that space and time to revisit, renew, and recommit to information, knowledge, tasks, discussion like that we present tonight. And then also because we're sharing a space here too, it's important that we all are mindful of each other's schedules and time. And I am really trying to commit myself to be done at 8. So I'm working on that. And just to be mindful of your time. And I appreciate everyone that does come on and stays with me until the end, until I finish. Um, but I appreciate your commitment to that, and so I want to do the same for you as well. And so again, these are just a guide for us in building and sustaining healthy and peaceful relationships, but also at the same time, we simultaneously dismantle colonial-based toxic behaviors like white supremacy culture and characteristics that really contradict our indigenous values. And really, when we do this and practice this, this sets a model and a standard for what we really want to see in our communities. And so it's important that we embody those. And so I always present this as well because it's important that we renew this. Because if we forget, we can sometimes tend to stray back to these because unfortunately they're incredibly normalized in our communities. And so we really want to, okay, name these things so that we can really work to actively embody and center our cultural practices as opposed to kind of reverting to these normalized things, which really are just detrimental aspects to our health, to our wellness in community, but also to us as individuals. So we recognize that our communities essentially are tools of colonization, and we've been indoctrinated into and adopted these both as cultural and organizational practices and protocol. And so really the idea is to revisit these because we want to teach and build awareness in order to enact systemic change. Um, and so we want to just remember these and using the community agreements and the 4 R's. And so again, those characteristics of white supremacy culture are perfectionism, sense of urgency. This is going to be pretty prominent in our discussion tonight about language and understanding second language acquisition and immersion. This idea of defensiveness, quantity over quality, the worship of the written word is another characteristic that we're going to see pretty prominent in tonight's discussion as well. There's only one right way. That's pretty prominent throughout a lot of the topics we've talked about in the teachings thus far. Paternalism, either or thinking, these ideas of power hoarding, the fear of open conflict, individualism. That's another important one that comes up, especially in the topic we'll talk about tonight. I'm the only one. Progress is kind of in terms of this idea of productivity. So the idea of like bigger and more. this idea of objectivity, which is really non-existent, especially when you understand it from an indigenous lens. Because if we understand that ourselves are connected to everyone and everything in the universe, um, that connection, that subjectivity is actually a strength because we understand the relationships and how to show up in the relationality we have with not just ourselves, but others, but all of creation, from the winds to the flowers to the grasses to the trees and everything in between. And also, lastly, this right to comfort. So keep in mind these characteristics of white supremacy culture and also that really settler colonialism. It's what we could also kind of understand white supremacy culture to be in a system that it's intentionally built on five different pillars, and that's racism, classism, capitalism, patriarchy, and Christianity. And so these characteristics show up in those five pillars and vice versa. The pillars show up in the characteristics or behaviors. We could also understand these as behaviors of white supremacy culture. And really, it's these behaviors that sustain and uphold the system as a way to essentially legitimize and justify extraction, exploitation, and eradication of indigenous ways of being, especially language, as we talk about that tonight. But really, it's in the pursuit of power, control, and greed. And so it's in terms of language, it's really an attempt to eliminate language in what we know to be the United States today. Um, so the purpose specifically of this teach-in is to really focus on the current state of Oneida language in the community, the types of programming that exists in the community, but also really understand there's differences between different types of programming, whether that's immersion or second language acquisition, which sometimes I refer to in this teach-in as SLA. It's just the acronym. And but also connect language learning to decolonization and actually why those two different methods are important for the health of language in a community. And really, this is to understand the history of language and why that matters for a community, so that we can build advocacy for language in our community, but also we can create essentially a plan, but also a pathway to sustainable language reclamation in the community. And so doing it in a teaching space is just to really foster that idea of community, and create that learning space and have a gathering for action and change, so that we can have some learning, dialogue, and really a collective understanding of this topic that really deeply affects our people and our future of our language and our community. So the intent is to really share knowledge, reflect together, and build this shared sense of purpose, raise awareness, inspire critical thinking, and really move us towards that concrete action, especially for language that is important for our community here today. So the context, the history of Oneida language, this is really important to kind of frame and kind of name the topic before we really focus on different methods of language teaching and learning. So the state of Oneida language, according to UNESCO, it's a specialized agency of the United Nations. It's an acronym for the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, otherwise known as UNESCO. It's classified as critically endangered. So this is actually the highest classification of UNESCO. And so critically endangered means it's at the brink and the breaking point of irreversible loss well into the future. And so if you know anything about the Oneida community, there's actually three communities of Oneida people. Our ancestral homelands are now what is known to be present-day New York State. Obviously, it wasn't called that prior to the establishment of the United States. But because of history, Indian removal, illegal treaties, land theft, that forced our removal here to Wisconsin. That removal is really important in understanding our history because the Oneida community that exists in Wisconsin is actually the furthest removed from our ancestral homelands. That is one significant reason why our language exists the way it does today. Language and land go hand in hand. There's a strong correlation between language, connection, the strength and the health of a language, and land. So when you have a group of people that are removed from their land base, because land is sustenance, it provides food, shelter, safety, warmth, protection, and all these other ways of life. And that includes using and through the medium of language. When you have land loss, a group of people suffer grief. And when they suffer grief, that essentially, if it's not healed or acknowledged, it shows up as trauma. And trauma impacts language loss. So that's not the only reason why our language exists the way it does today, but it is a significant understanding for the context of Oneida in our community here today. Um, so like I had mentioned, there's three communities of Oneida. One that still exists in New York, that's the smallest community. A second one that exists on the other side of the border in Canada. And then the third one that exists, which is actually the highest population of Oneida people, which is in Wisconsin here. And so, um, but like I had mentioned, the largest group of Oneida people, which exists in Wisconsin, has the lowest number of fluent speakers or proficient speakers of the language. And that is directly tied to the removal from our ancestral homelands, and the trauma and grief that goes along with land loss, and as well as a lot of other factors. But that's a unique factor for the Oneida people in Wisconsin that I wanted to just highlight. So focusing for this specific teach-in tonight, I want to focus specifically on this community and understanding what critically endangered means for the Oneida language for Oneidas here in Wisconsin. So within the Wisconsin Oneida community, there's only two speakers left. There's approximately 17,254 enrolled tribal members. I actually think it's a little higher. I think that number is from the enrollments numbers from about 2 or 3 years ago. So that's a little higher now, but it's still in the same approximation of enrolled tribal members. So that actually equates to 0.01% of our population that can speak the language. So that is incredibly eye-opening. The other thing that is important to understand in that piece of data is that that number of 17,000 enrolled tribal members does not include descendants. It doesn't include adoptees, people that may be married into the community. And it has essentially contributed or been raised in a community because we understand, and in a few teachings ago, I talked about community, that that's a reciprocal relationship and that we also have adoption processes. I talked about blood quantum and what that means for identity. And so identity isn't necessarily linked to blood quantum, although we tend to designate that through, a tribal ID card and an enrollment card. So that number actually we could say is that percentage is even much lower because the number of individuals that associate or connect or identify with being an Oneida tribal member or community member, which would include descendants and people that maybe have married into a community or have been adopted through perhaps a cultural process or reciprocal process, would actually be much higher than 17,000. So that means we would have about two speakers of more than 17,000, which would make that 0.01% even smaller, as if it's not already small. So I just wanted to note that because the data doesn't always tell that full story either. I think it's important just for some kind of contextual understanding so that we can have a shared understanding essentially of what does critically endangered mean. But again, it's always important to have that quantitative community perspective in understanding data because it gives you a much more fuller picture of what that means. And it actually means that it's even more worse than what the data says. And these two speakers are both older gentlemen. They're later 60s, early 70s. And so we are really struggling with, creating new speakers. We're at a crossroads because there's no longer intergenerational transmission happening within the language, within families, within our community through whatever means. And that really has been interrupted by the history of colonization, of contact, and also through colonial policies. So really right now we are at a very critical crossroads of our point of existence currently right now and well into the future. So we basically have two choices. We have an irreparable, irreversible loss of our language, our culture, our lifeways, or a shift towards self-sufficiency and self-determination. And so that is very apparent in understanding the data. And so what is hopeful though is although we have this information now, this gives us an idea of the reality. That's why I always share the context and the history of how Oneida language exists. But we want to be able to keep that as a frame of reference so that we can create programming that speaks to that need. of language loss in our community. And so there is a lot of hope at the same time. And that there's a number of efforts and individuals and groups of people seeking to really rebuild speakership in our community. So that includes the use of immersion and second language acquisition approaches. So I've showed this visual before, I think at the last teach-in. So you might remember this from the previous one. I talked about it actually a little differently in the last teach-in, but I wanted to talk about it specifically as understanding the importance of language. So really, when we think about why is Oneida language important, when I ask an individual this, they all have a different response. And those are all important because that really centers your why. It centers your motivation and intention for embarking on a language learning journey. It helps you to kind of frame your intentions and your relationship with the language. So when we think about language collectively, we also want to understand why is the language collectively important to us. And so language is really the center of our way of life. It's a web of connection. And so I actually teach a class, a night class at the local tribal college here. And I teach the language class. It's the spring semester. So when I teach the class, before I even get into the content, I do a really brief activity with the students and I ask them, why is Oneida language important? And there's no right or wrong answers. This is just a discussion. And what I do is every time a student answers, I have like a big ball of yarn. And when they answer, I make them grab a piece of that yarn and they have to hold it. And so I write down whatever their response is. And then when someone else answers, they hold on to their piece and then they give the yarn off to someone else who will answer. And so after a while, all these students answer. And basically, they create a web. And that they're all connected. So everything that they said, I usually just capture all their responses on the whiteboard. But it's a visual representation of the importance of language. It shows them that everything is connected. And so instead, for this graphic, I use the circle wampum and just put language in the middle. And really, language connects us to all these different aspects of our ways of life, including our culture, our ceremonies, our foods, our plant knowledge, our medicines, our songs and our dances, our agricultural practices, our identity, our ideas of health and wellness and medicine, this connection to land that I had mentioned a little bit earlier, even our ideas of governance and sovereignty and diplomacy, our history, um, understanding our traditional economies and our treaties and treaty rights are really important. They give us more insight into gender fluidity and how that is found in our cultural practices, specifically through the use of different pronouns in our language. It really comes down to that. And also these traditional art forms are practices of basketry, of beadwork, of quill work, of pottery. There are ideas of cosmology, how we're connected to the universe and the stars and the sky world from our creation story. Our ideas of games and sports, from ceremonial games like Peachstone to some of our more social sports like lacrosse. Our ideas of land stewardship, what is our relationship to the land? And we see that within our speech called the opening address. And that really designates our kinship relationship to every element in the natural world. It gives us a better understanding to kinship in our clans and our relationships with family, and how family isn't just our mother and our siblings and our father and aunts and uncles and grandparents, but really that extends into community, that all of these people are our aunties and uncles and our cousins. Our birthing practices, our harvesting practices, and hunting, as well as history. So you can see how broadly language connects to all of these things. So if you think about this, this is just a question to think and reflect on. If we didn't have language, we would lose a very strong connection to all of these other lifeways. So that's how important language really is. That's how, when we say a critical crossroads, that's truly what we mean. It's almost like taking the thread out of one of these strings and then everything kind of falls to the ground. So that is a pretty significant threat, I guess, to our ways of life. And so I know this is a lot of content on the page. I'm not going to go through it all, but it's recorded. So if you want to watch it back, you can do that. But I use the same circle wampum to really give you a better understanding of actually the vast amount of language programming that's happening in the Oneida community. And so I use the same visual of the circle wampum. If you've noticed, I like using that, but it really demonstrates community and how all these different pieces really come together to create a collective. And so when we look at the circle wampum, and we see that every strand on this graphic, and you probably can't see them that well, but if you watch the visual or the video back, you'll be able to see that every strand has a name or a word on it, and that there's a key on the side with the list. Um, but this basically represents a program, an initiative, a class, or an opportunity available in this community that all essentially seek to protect and preserve our language. And all of that is offered to the people, it's bound to the people. And so it's a connecting point. When you think about like language or ceremonies or a culture, that this is actually a bridge to the people. So all these programs are like a bridge to the people, a bridge to wellness, identity, language, proficiency development, speakership to people. And so the idea is really is providing access, but also wellness, identity reclamation for people. And it's also really important to name the opportunities that exist in the community. So some of these opportunities are kind of overlapping with a few programs that exist in Oneida Town in on the Canadian side, but and I only list them there because some of our um, community members here in Wisconsin do take advantage of some of those opportunities in the other community and vice versa. So most of these, though, exist in the Oneida community here in Wisconsin. And so we have a few different programs that one of them includes a Oneida Language Medium School, or what we had previously called a language nest that actually exists in Scotney-Goulet in the nonprofit here. We also have a program, I didn't finish the name on here, but it's called Sagodiwana Gate Squash. It's a program that's in the process of being launched in about another year or so, which is an adult immersion program. The nonprofit Scotney-Goulet, the Oneida Nation organization and tribe has a language department. They also have a cultural heritage department. There's a lot of resources at the local schools, including a few of the local universities at the University of Wisconsin Green Bay, UW-Madison, and UW-Milwaukee, as well as the local tribal college here, the College of Menominee Nation. We also have a variety of digital and online resources, specifically a documented digital dictionary available on the University of Wisconsin Green Bay's website that has not just the dictionary, but it also has an audio version of every single word in that dictionary. We're really fortunate here in this community to have our own documented dictionary, but we're even more fortunate because the other community on the Canadian side also has a documented dictionary. So the Oneida language actually has two dictionaries that exist. And both of those are used by community members here and on the other side. And so there's a lot of programming that exists for language in this community, whether it's in-person classes, through the library, through local universities, through some of the childcare programs that are here in the community, like the Airport Road Childcare, and also opportunities for language to be heard at ceremonies within our longhouse. That's natural language exposure. We also have a variety of apps that are available. Oneida here has two different apps that are available on your application web store or Google Play, whatever you use on your phone, as well as other digital resources actually through UW-Madison. We're really fortunate in this community to have an extensive amount of documentation. One significant project that was done in the early 1900s through learners and students of a linguist named Floyd Lounsbury. Those individuals had worked with speakers here at that time to create an orthography of the Oneida language. And those speakers basically documented the language using that same orthography. And they also interviewed other speakers. And those interviews basically formed what is a significant oral history project, a collection of stories of the Oneida language. And all of those stories have been transcribed into English and transcribed in Oneida linguistics using that same orthography. So they're really, really strongly strong resources for learners, especially highly proficient learners. Because even though we don't have many speakers, we have so much rich audio and documentation through those stories. And that's listed on 28 here. That's kind of where I'm following along. But I just wanted to emphasize that there's a lot of not only classes, but there's also resources. So these opportunities include those resources, they include programs, they include classes, and all of these things that are truly available to the community. And there's a few other curriculums that are out there. Um, the linguist that had worked with the Oneida community here, his name was Cliff Abbott. He is retired, but he still does work with language, Oneida language reclamation in this community. He was a professor, a linguist, and he was one of those students that I had mentioned, the academic students that was trained under Lounsbury. And they actually went on to basically document all Haudenosaunee languages, which one of them was Oneida. And so he actually worked to create a really important curriculum with a speaker that had passed away maybe about 10 or 12 years ago now. She was our last female fluent speaker in this community. Her name was Maria Hinton. She also worked with him to create the dictionary that we use here in our community. But they created a K through 6 educational curriculum. So that's also another important resource for our community. So there is the idea, and I wish I could talk about this. This would be a perfect another teaching to explore all these resources for some time in the future. But the idea is that there are so many resources that are available, resources, classes, programs, initiatives happening across this community for our community. And so I'm going to continue on. But again, if you wanted to look through this more, you can revisit the recording that I'll send out to you all tomorrow. But really, that is the idea: is we have so many things that are available to our community. So why are we still at that crossroads of critically endangered? Well, we'll talk about that because it's important to understand what are these programs and initiatives doing? How do they contribute to language reclamation? And how do we create a more clear and sustainable pathway to language reclamation in this community? So, when we think about all the programming and the reality of what exists in this community, it is also important to acknowledge how did we get here. So, I talked already about the removal of Oneida people from what is New York today, but there's also been a lot more impacts of colonization to our people. And one of those is kind of basically a vague characterization of what has happened to our people. It's really basically ongoing assimilation and eradication of our ways since 1492, since the first point of settler contact. And this has been enacted throughout a variety of strategies by settlers, by the United States, and that really continues to pervade our communities today. The only thing is, they are a lot more invisible today. Um, when we look at history, we see that there's a lot more overt attempts to disrupt our lifeways through boarding schools, through policies like language bans and being punished for speaking, either through boarding schools or just having our language outlawed. And so, prior to the establishment of the Native American Languages Act, it was outlawed. And prior to the establishment of the American Indian Religious Freedom Act, it was outlawed to practice your culture and speak your language. And that's not that long ago because the Native American Languages Act was only passed in 1990. So this is not like a distant history. This is within living generations of our people. So this still exists today. But we saw, even 50, 30, 40 years ago, really overt attempts to silence, suppress, and basically eliminate our languages through boarding schools, through these language bans, outlawing of language. But a lot of times today, it's kind of shifted. It's still very present, but it's not a little bit, it's a lot more invisible. And so the characteristics and behaviors of white supremacy culture that I had mentioned, that is really a powerful infiltration of white supremacy culture, of ideology in our communities. So, like those ideas of um, worship of the written word, this idea of individualism or either or thinking, that shows up in a few other issues of how we got here. So I'll share more about that shortly, but I just want you to kind of plant the seed and understanding, okay, white supremacy culture infiltrates still our community today in an invisible way. Public education. Public education is actually a really invisible way of suppressing our languages, because what I like to call them is they're just English immersion schools. I always say like every school is an immersion school. So even though we call like indigenous native language schools like immersion schools, every school is an immersion school, every single one. It just depends on the medium of instruction. And public schools are all based in English. So the majority of our students attend public schools and they are still being taught in English. And so that is a more invisible and also an acceptable approach. Because it's invisible, it's becoming normalized. Because it's normalized, it's accepted. So the purpose of this teaching is to really develop those critical thinking skills, because if we want to stand as sovereign people that base our decisions on self-determination, we need to start asking questions about public education, because public education isn't teaching our students about who they are. It's teaching them about general standards that they want all students to know, that are based on common core standards of math and science, and language, but are English language based. And so there's a lot of things that we see in public education. Another important piece to kind of acknowledge about how does public education affect our Native students. Well, when we really look at the data, we actually see a significant disproportionate gap of student success in public education. And I used to work at a public school, and I kind of used to laugh because they would always say like, well, why are the Native students falling behind? Why are they, not doing why aren't they academically successful? So academic success can be defined as, grades, but it could also be described as engagement in school, attendance. All of those are factors in student success. And I used to laugh, and I was just saying like, okay, our students have only been trained in English for the last 150 years. They've been speaking their languages since millennia, since the time of creation. So when you take them from that ancestral familiar approach to language, you're taking a part of their spirit, one, but you are going to see that there's going to be disproportionate, perceived success of Native students in these schools, because they are not used to being one in a formal school institution, but also their ancestral memory is based in the language. So it's new. English is actually new for our people. Even though we all speak English and we're essentially first language English speakers today, it's still very new to our community. We haven't been, we're not super, we do need to work on decolonization, but we are still very much tied to our ways. And so that's why there's a disproportionate gap in student success for Native students compared to all other demographics of students. Also, those schools are not created for Indigenous people either. They're not speaking to their strengths. They're not speaking to content. When you focus on presenting content for Native students that's based in um, their culture, their worldview, even through those subjects like math and science, you're actually going to see success in those classes, academic success. So all of these things are correlated. All of these things are tied together in a sense. Everything is connected. But really, what this results in is the loss of language. So not just where we're at today with kind of that invisible infiltration of white supremacy ideology and public education, but even previously, the history, assimilation, boarding schools, outlawing of language and cultural practices, all of that results in loss of language. It results in the loss of identity. I had already mentioned like land theft, broken treaties, and removal are also significant factors in language loss. So if you compound all of that, all of these things that were essentially targeted to Indigenous people to really break them down, to assimilate them, that results in a significant loss of identity. But what does that really mean? Well, when we look at it, all of that is loss. Loss is when you experience loss, um, it's basically a grief. It's a grief. And so when we see grief in a community, that's a very traumatic experience. And so the loss of everything that had happened to our people since the point of contact to now is what we can characterize as a traumatic experience. And a lot of times in the research, they call that historical trauma, or the technical term, it also can be understood to be as generational trauma. What happens when you see that the trauma continues as a cycle unless it's not broken, unless it's not acknowledged and disrupted. And really, that cycle continuates and perpetuates as shame, as violence, a lot of other things, substance abuse, poor health, incarceration, and basically that loss of identity. That is how that shows up. So that's because of language loss. One reason, not the sole reason, but a significant reason. And so really we know that language is actually a very positive, proactive approach to restoring wellness in a community, because language, when you restore language, you restore identity. When you restore identity, you basically restore a whole person. So they're less likely to engage in maybe risky behaviors like violence, or substance abuse, suicide, incarceration. They'll have better health and wellness. So again, all of these things have a correlation again. Another reason to how we got here really focuses on language, specifically language. So we talked a little bit about history, how that shows up for our people in terms of historical trauma and grief and loss. But another one specifically focuses on English, the English language. What we can call this is settler linguicide, and that's just a fancy term for the intentional erasure of a language. Intentional, but also invisible. So I like to highlight that because a lot of times we don't even see that this is happening, but it's happening. And that is kind of the really dangerous part of colonization and how that shows up in our community. Because when it's invisible, like I said, it's normalized, then it's accepted. And then we don't question it anymore just because it's there. And so that's the whole purpose of this teaching, is to really kind of start to re-fire up everything in your brain to inspire that idea of critical thinking and make those connections. Um, but the dominance of English language in this country and in our society, because of that dominance, there's already an automatic devaluing of the Oneida language that exists because of that. So when that automatic devaluing happens of the language, what happens in place of it is, I don't really care to learn language. What is the point of learning language? Because we got to use English. We have to have a job, yada, yada, yada. So what does that sound like? That's basically stereotypes that are perpetuated because of that, misconceptions that are perpetuated because of that, assumptions that circulate under this pressure of the dominance of English language. A lot of times, because I teach in an immersion program, and in the past, I've heard a lot of comments that were in terms of literacy. And so parents or community people would say, well, if they're learning language, are they ever going to learn to read in English? And I always thought that that was such an interesting comment, because it showed how unaware we were in the community of the benefits of language learning. But that said something deeper. It already suggested that there was a devaluing of Oneida language happening, because usually what people say, there's always some undercurrent of what they're feeling, and that's how we get to truly understand, what are we valuing, and that's really important, our values. And so if we look at the research, and this is again another topic for another day, but the research does say, and we already knew this as Indigenous people, but the research also justifies that learning literacy in an Indigenous language, that same skill of learning to read, translates to any other language like English. And so I have two older students in my class, and we do literacy practice and lessons in Oneida. And we've never formally taught them to read English, but because they do it in Oneida, they have actually been self-learners and self-teaching themselves how to read in English. And they actually make really awesome distinctions between the two languages. And they also make connections. And so there's like significant benefits to being bilingual, but also that those skills, they are not, They're not unique just to one language. They actually translate into multiple languages. And so, really, when we look at also settler linguicide, we also see the value of the written word. So, I mentioned that earlier. That means that there's already an automatic devaluing of oral narratives, like indigenous languages, like the Oneida language, because the oral transmission of our language was a significant part of how we learned within our family structures, within our clan structures. And so this is really challenging because in white supremacy culture, there's also this idea of binary. It's either this or this. So even though I talked about like the value of the written word, there's a second characteristic of white supremacy culture at play there, and that's the either or thinking or the binary, which we call that sometimes too. So either we're valuing the written word or we're not. So if they're an oral narrative, we're not going to value it. But remember, I talked about indigenous understanding values the coexistence of multiple perspectives. So even if we value language learning and language immersion, it doesn't mean that we automatically devalue English. But from a white Western understanding, that is true. It's not right, but it's what is true for white supremacy culture. So I just wanted to frame it in that way so you understand that. Um, there's a few left here too. The value of monolingualism. I always find this to be a very interesting discussion in terms of kind of the political environment we exist in within the United States. So only within the United States, there's a significant value of monolingualism. And that's very contrary to the rest of the world. Most countries in the world actually value bilingualism and even trilingualism, if not more. So if you go to almost any other country in the world, most people speak more than one language. And they value that too, because there's a lot of benefits, a lot of cognitive benefits to learning and speaking and knowing more than one language. But it also makes you more open. It makes you more appreciative of other cultures, other ways of life, and you have more fluidity between those different perspectives. And so that's really important. So I always kind of find it really interesting because we've kind of adopted that in our own communities. So instead, we'll have our own community saying, okay, well, we're not really going to value language, but they need English, which is such a very interesting, I guess, um, assumption I see within our own community. But it's important to kind of take a little bit of a holistic perspective on this and really, okay, what does this really mean in terms of a global perspective? And also, another important factor of how we got here is really the loss of traditional governing structures that carried our language. So I talked about this in a few teachings ago, but those ideas of blood quantum are tied to the introduction of colonial models of governance through the Indian Reorganization Act and what I could call colonial governments or New Deal governments. Even though they're kind of packaged up in a nice little presentable way to say, here, you now have democracy, it was actually a very, very intentional model of colonization that was forced on our communities so that we would have federal recognition, even though we already had traditional governing structures in our communities. So, really, that resulted in this idea of kinship and connection, the loss of our family structures that carried that intergenerational transmission. So, really, all of this really tells us that there was a drastic reduction. The result was a drastic reduction in fluent speakers. And this is really also what the reason was for a language shift towards English. And a lot of that was invisible. Um, so I'm trying to make up some time here. I'm working on it. So when we think about language, and the history and the context, language is a form of decolonization. From every supporter, learner, teacher, speaker, and ally, they are a part of this reclamation. Language revitalization actually has room and space for so many roles. So not everyone's a teacher, not everyone's a learner, but there's so many roles and different goals that people have in language. And it's not just communication. Language is actually liberation. Because language holds worldview, ceremony, law, and identity, every single word basically embodies this way of seeing and relating and of knowing of the world and how that is distinct for Oneida people. And speaking the language is really an act of sovereignty. So every word, it reclaims our ways, our power from colonial structures and systems that tried to erase it. Language revitalization, it repairs the disruption. It also disrupts historical trauma. and the cycle of trauma. And it heals the cultural, spiritual, and social fabrics um, caused or fractures caused by colonization and linguicide. So it heals the fabrics of our community, but it also heals the fractures caused by colonization and boarding schools that resulted in the trauma. And so I think that's a repeated one. But speaking language is, oh, I already mentioned this, an act of sovereignty. But really, when we talk about decolonization through language, it means that we're actually restoring systems of knowledge. We're restoring governance. We're restoring our stories, our history. We're moving away from English-centered education, and we're moving towards our own forms of education and also our own worldview, our Oneida worldview. We're returning also to relational accountability and understanding that language is actually it's education for us, but that's a form of ceremony. Ceremony is education for us. So sometimes we have kind of like a disconnected understanding of ceremony, like it's a place we go to and we give thanks. That is one form of ceremony, but another form of ceremony is just how we live and relate to the world in every day. And practicing and speaking language is an act of ceremony. So it's not just curriculum. It's not this colonial idea of like compartmentalizing subjects from math and science, but it's really a holistic understanding of how we see the world. Um, and it also it means that we're able to, I talked about this at the last teach-in, but refuse those colonial metrics like fluency or measures of fluency and also the metrics of literacy. So we do have understandings of proficiency and literacy progress in our language, but we don't center those. That's the difference. Um, as the only measures of success, right? So it's important to keep an awareness and a pulse on it, but not to center it because that's not necessarily our practice. And that also language revitalization repairs the community fabrics that were, again, caused by colonization. So, what I like to think about language learning is actually a really healing approach. It's a proactive approach to healing historical and generational trauma. Um, so there's different types of language that exist in a community, and there's two different ones that essentially exist in our community. Those different types of programming are characterized by the two different approaches to language revitalization, which is immersion and second language acquisition. So I'll talk about those here on the next slide, but I just wanted to briefly kind of show like what is happening in our community. So we do have an early childhood language nest that exists in our nonprofit here in Scotney-Gula. That's the only language nest we have in our community. We also have an emerging adult program that's actually focused on creating teachers for the language nest. Because if you work in this work, you'll know that those two things are directly tied. The needs are tied to each other. If we don't have teachers, we can't administer a language nest program. And so we have to pay and give a lot of attention to those for the language. But we also have a lot of SLA or second language immersion programs that exist in this community. So, like I had mentioned, there's a language department within the tribe that serves a variety of public schools in the local area. There's a few different colleges that I had mentioned and universities that also provide Oneida language classes. Those are used, the approach in those classes are second language acquisition. And there's also community-based culture and language programming that's also based using the technique of second language acquisition through a few different departments that are listed on the screen, whether it's culture heritage. I think the museum had programming happening at one point in time. The community libraries, the CIATS program in Milwaukee for Oneidas that live in that area as well. So really to understand those programming opportunities that are available in our community, it's important to understand like which is which. And so when we think about this idea of immersion, when I first started doing this in the community, I usually, when I would say like we have a language nest and we use immersion as the medium of instruction, you would kind of see like people like shudder like but it was really interesting because they would have like a physical reaction to just this really simple word immersion and but it told me a lot that okay we one don't really know what immersion is two it's very new and three it told us a lot about language loss and really identity and how historical trauma shows up in spaces like that. So if we understand what immersion is really The target language is the primary language used in instruction. So it's basically a technique that seeks to build natural proficiency in the target language. So it's like a teaching technique that we use as educators to build student proficiency in Oneida. And basically you learn all of your content through the language, through the medium of the language. So when I talk about second language acquisition, you'll see the difference here shortly. But basically, we teach everything, whether it's culture, whether it's mathematics, whether it's history or stories, ceremonies, literacy, science, all of that is taught through the language. And so all content, students are learning all content through the Oneida language. Sometimes in research, you might, or kind of in the field or the movement of language revitalization, you might hear kind of, I guess people say that there's different forms of immersion. Yeah and no. Um, Immersion is done through solely the language. If it's not solely through the language, it's not immersion. Although some people might say that, they might say like, well, if it's done 50% of the time in immersion and 50% of the time in English, it's like a dual immersion program. The issue with that is that there's still English. And when we understand the context of language, that the dominance of English that exists, and because the home language of majority of students is English, the English dominance will still suppress the language, even in dual immersion programs. So the idea of building language proficiency is essentially stifled in a dual immersion program. So it doesn't quite support the language progress that is intended in immersion. So if people that work in these types of settings will tell you if it's not all in the language, it's not immersion, which I do myself. So I would also agree with that. It's not immersion if it's not all 100% in the language. So it's really important to have that understanding just because there is benefits and motivations and goals tied to having it in all immersion because immersion builds proficiency at a really fast rate. So some of those benefits include building comprehension, speaking, and proficiency very rapidly. It creates thinking in the target language. It really builds speakers. It preserves the worldview because if you are creating a speaker within a young child, and immersion, I didn't note it on here, but it's best done with young children, usually children 0 to 5, because they're kind of at that prime age of language acquisition. Um, I guess like physically, mentally, psychologically speaking, they are like sponges at that age. Their child development, 0 to 5, is a target, a prime age of acquisition for language development. So usually language immersion programs start at those ages. And as English is introduced and solidified in a child that becomes older, it's harder to start them in an immersion program. So that's like a whole topic for another day because this is a little bit more introductory. But benefits of immersion also include kind of mirroring traditional first language acquisition. It's not entirely there, but it is a approach to kind of provide an educational format for intergenerational transmission, language transmission. There's challenges too, because it creates significant staffing and a lot of times staff that are not available that you have to train on the job because there's really nowhere you can go that will outside of the immersion program that exists, there's not really anywhere you can go, like a local university that will train immersion teachers unless there's already an established program there. But for our community here, we do not have that. And it also requires a significant amount of resources. We need a lot of language curriculum resources, and oftentimes we have to create that ourselves. There's no magazine where we can flip through curriculums and say, okay, I would like that Oneida language mathematics curriculum. We have to create that ourselves. And also, it also creates a lot of community buy-in. And one thing that's not on here is it also requires a significant amount of funding because this is a lot of work. And it's a lot more work than any general teacher faces in a public school. They don't generally have to get training on the job. They don't generally have to overcome historical trauma and identity loss that's tied to their language. They generally don't have to create their own curriculum.
and then also create the lessons from it, which is a whole nother ball game. So if you think about it, a lot of times immersion instructors are doing like four jobs in one, and writing the grants and all the other fun stuff that goes along with it. So that's why a lot of times, especially if you look at immersion environments, you will see like miracles happen. People that are doing a lot of work just to really hold on to their language, but that's what it requires too. So when we talk about community buy-in, I think it's important to understand what it takes to run an immersion program so that people can understand, the dedication that's required because it does require a high level of commitment from learners, teachers, and families, an investment, not just commitment, but an investment that's reciprocal because the program invests in the students, but the families also have to invest in the program and the students. And so there has to be strong relationships with that. But a deeper dive too, because sometimes immersion, and this is a little bit getting a little bit more deeper into the weeds, because a lot of people just don't really know what immersion is. But if you've kind of familiar with the movement in language revitalization, you'll know that there's a little bit of a shift happening in the movement to a more accurate use of the term immersion, and that's really understanding it more as language medium education. This is a little bit more all-encompassing and appropriate and in alignment with our indigenous values and forms of education because it is similar, but it is the way I kind of like to describe it as immersion is like a technique. And language medium education is a little bit more holistic. But it also is reflective of the unique history of Indigenous people, like language loss, like historical trauma, because immersion can be done in any language. It doesn't have to be just Oneida language. It can be done in French and Spanish. Though that's a technique that's global. But language medium education also includes these ideas of environment, history, curriculum, worldview. There's a lot of considerations that make up language medium education that's more appropriate and accurate for kind of our understanding of this same term. And so it means teaching through the language, it means learning through the language. It's a reciprocal approach to language medium education. So if you think about the medium, it means that there's two different things happening there, right? There's the learner and the teacher, and the medium is the language. So there's like this fluid exchange of language happening between these groups of people, teachers and learners. And it centers language as the primary medium of instruction, but also thinking and expression across all subjects. So you can see the similarities, but it's also important to understand this is a little bit more of a holistic understanding. And there's a lot more to this, but that's like a whole nother teaching. So, and I know I'm kind of getting low on the time, so I'm kind of trying to be mindful of that. So, but really, when you think about language medium education, it's just a deeper dive into understanding this that's more aligned with uh, Oneida language revitalization. So basically, learners live and learn in the language. It allows them to shape how they reason, how they think, how they make meaning. It restores a natural intergenerational process of language transmission that's disrupted by colonization, and it reflects an indigenous worldview where language, culture, and identity are inseparable. But it's an act of sovereignty. That's, I think, one of the most important parts of understanding language medium education is it's an act of sovereignty by indigenous people to reclaim their language through their own means, understanding that history, that English dominance, settler linguicide, and also the history that accompanies some of the trauma in the boarding schools and those experiences that have happened in our communities. And it focuses on healing. It's rebuilding knowledge systems grounded in language itself. So when we say it's an act of sovereignty, it's really a right. It's an inherent right of our people to be educated in their own language and to have opportunities for them to be educated in their own language. And so that's really more of the focus of language medium education. There's a lot more I could go on about that, but this is a little bit more introductory. So second language acquisition or SLA, it's learning the language, learning the target language as an additional language. And so it's kind of like a part-time and understanding of the language, but it's also done in an English dominant setting. So in a second language acquisition environment, your teacher is using English to teach about the language. So learning in this context, it's really not learning through the language, it's learning about the language. You're studying the language, but you're not using the language to learn the language, if that makes sense. So there's a very big distinction. It's using English to study the language. So most of our environments that exist in our community are SLA. Actually, very few of them are immersion. The majority of them are SLA. And so the way I always think about or frame this is if you ever took like a foreign language in high school, if you took French or Spanish, those were all SLA environments because your teacher taught you about Spanish or French using English. And unless you got to like a higher level of language, like Spanish 5 or something like that, they might only use the language. But usually in the introductory classes, they were only using English and they'll teach you about the language, they'll teach you phrases, but they're doing it through English. That is second language acquisition. And it's exactly what it sounds like. It's a second language. You're acquiring a second language through the use of another language, which is English. So there are benefits, though. This is an important environment for language learning. Um, and it is more accessible to larger numbers of learners. But it's just accessible in general to people. It's the starting point for language revitalization and language learning. And it can be integrated in a more vast variety of environments. So it can be integrated in schools, community programs, universities, all these areas of second language environments can be integrated into. There is challenges at the same time, and there's a slower language acquisition rate. And there's also limited exposure, which reduces your retention. And usually, like if you ever took like a foreign language in high school or in college, you probably only had maybe an hour max of that. So if you think about that, an hour a day, 5 days a week, or even an hour a week is very limited to, say, an immersion environment, which is 8 hours a day for 5 days a week. So you're talking maybe 5 hours compared to 30 or 40 hours in language. And those amount of the hours of exposure of language contribute to the development of proficiency. So you're going to get a lower rate of proficiency development in SLA environments or a much faster, higher rate of immersion. Now, immersion is much more challenging. It requires a different skill set. But SLA is it's a starting point. It's an introductory area. So I could go on a lot about this, but at least I think you have an idea of what SLA and immersion is. So really, just to kind of sum that up, they're all important. That's the whole point. Is we don't want to continue white supremacy culture and say it's either going to be SLA or immersion. No, we need both. We need both of them. They both have a role in this community because SLA is really important. It's an important starting point for our community so that we can kind of progress towards immersion. Because that's how we've actually gotten to this point in our community here. So immersion really is a deep, rapid proficiency development, and SLA is more of a broad form of community engagement, and it also builds language awareness. It's a little bit more introductory, I'll say that, but it gives people a starting point. And SLA supports foundational growth in the language. A lot of educators, immersion educators, actually start out learning language in SLA environments. So that's my story for learning language. Is I was actually a teacher. I used to teach Oneida in a local high school, and I taught it through second language acquisition. It was a world language in the world languages department, and I also learned Oneida through second language environments, and then transitioned to an immersion environment. And so a lot of people start out through SLA because it's accessible, it's a starting point. And really, a thriving language revitalization movement uses both. Both of them exist because strategically this is needed, and it's really to support the need in the community because there is such a great need of language in our community that we don't even have enough capacity to support that. Um, and it also supports the growth for language development in a community. And we need both because it supports learners from a variety of ages, demographics, abilities, and individual motivations. So you might have an elder that wants to learn language for the first time. That's going to be a different goal and motivation for them versus maybe a 3-year-old or a family that wants to put their 3-year-old in an immersion program. You're going to have two very different goals. You might have one that's wants just I just want to learn some language. I just want to learn some introductory stuff. Yes, we need that. And we also need the immersion programs because we want to create speakers. We need all of that across the board. because the existence of both in a community represents the health of our language. It represents our sustainability, and we need all of those options for people because not everyone wants to be a speaker. That's just realistic, but they do want to learn language. Maybe they want to introduce themselves. So we need to still have those opportunities for our people across ages because we want to provide high school classes or classes for the public schools. We want to provide classes for students in the local universities, in the immersion programs, for elders at the Oneida Library. We need all of that. But we also know that one or a small group of people can't do that all. So we need people at every single step to provide those different opportunities. So that's why we really need a strong investment in language across the board. And so really when we think about why all of that's needed in a community, the existence of all of that, these are significant indicators of what I like to call community health or wellness. Because the existence of all of those programs in a community does represent essentially the wellness of a community, or at least the opportunities that are presented for community. Now, there's still more factors to consider. Is the community taking advantage of the programs? That's the reciprocal nature of language. It's not just the opportunities, but are people actually engaging in language? Are they studying language? Are they practicing speech? Because as much as a community can provide language for them, the responsibility of language falls on yourself as an individual. How you motivated are you to learn language, to align your actions with the priority? Because oftentimes our communities say, yes, language is important, and they fall within the first 5 to 10 priorities of the community, but the funding doesn't say the same story. They're not the first programming or area to be funded. They're usually the last. So that's the dissonance there. That's the disconnect between priorities and action. And so those are the honest conversations about language. I think that's important for our community, but we can say the same for ourselves. We see that in community, but individually, a lot of times most people will say language is important, but are we actually aligning our actions with what we want to see for language for ourselves? So that's really important when we think about it. Um, so what can we do? We can have advocacy and education. That's the first step. A really core tenet of Scott and Goulet is to educate our people and educate people because that builds awareness. Before we can really take action, we have to really advocate and educate our people on these topics. So we really need to educate our community first. We know that language revitalization isn't just a program, it's a collective, but it's also an individual responsibility. And so when we understand our history and the context of our language and how we got here, like I had shared earlier, we can really have a strong foundation to support our language well into the future and current initiatives that happen in our communities. So, why does this matter? Well, it's really a window to sustainable language movements in a community. A lot of times those movements are fueled by a very small group of people that kind of shoulder and take on the majority of the work. And oftentimes when we look at, those small groups of people, a lot of times that creates burnout. It actually disproportionately affects their health and their own sense of wellness. And so we really need more people to understand and acknowledge and start to step up to support those people, take on roles, help in any way. Because there's roles for everyone. It's not just teacher, learner, but there's allies, there's funders, there's volunteers, there's supporters, there's grant writers, there's all these roles. And a lot of times, what really needs to happen is just take the initiative. You know that it takes a lot of work, and so we just have to step up and do it. They always say, don't wait to be asked, just go ahead and do it. So, um, it's important why this work matters to understand the context of what exists. The window for intergenerational transmission is narrowing because our language is critically endangered. So we have a very small window that's unknown, but it's very small. We know that it's small and it could be tomorrow that maybe our language disappears. And it could even be because of the current political climate we exist in. One of the requirements of sovereignty and federal recognition status that the United States government goes by is an active living language. So if they wanted to come in and say, how many speakers do you have? And, who's speaking the language? What are you doing with language work? okay, it looks like you're not doing that much, or you only have two speakers. I don't think you're going to be federally recognized anymore. That's a real threat, especially in the current political climate, to everyone. So even if you're not involved in language, it still impacts you in some way. So we don't know. That could happen tomorrow. So it's really important that we understand this reality. And every year without action, it's just more loss of speakers, more loss of cultural knowledge, more loss of our lifeways. And so we do have the tools, though. We have the knowledge, we have the leadership. To reverse this trend, but it's only if we mobilize now. We need to build our awareness and education about these topics, support for these programs, both SLA and immersion, everything that's happening. And we also need to put funding, and support doesn't just mean time, effort, and energy, yes, but it also means funding because a lot of these programs are severely underfunded. That is, and they're doing the work of like 4 or 5 jobs in one person. So we have to really advocate for programs like that. So this is just a call to action. Get involved in language learning at any level. Enroll in classes, language classes, support immersion initiatives with time, resources, and advocacy. Like I said, there's roles for everyone: learner, supporter, ally, volunteer, teacher, curriculum developer, funder, grant writer, family member, parent, so many. And when we say resources, it means time, energy, effort, but also financial resources, space, not just money, but spaces, vehicles, food, meals, helping to clean up the classroom, make resources, um, everything is needed across the board. Um, Language programming, I always mention this whenever anyone ever asks me like, what is the biggest need? It's always fun financial. But it's just true. It's severely underfunded, but we uphold the sovereignty of our people and the survival of our people for the future. So I think it's important that we really start aligning and embodying our priorities with our actions in our communities and advocate for that. Advocate our communities to mobilize towards that. But a starting point is to just educate yourself about this. Educate others about the urgency of language work and just spread the word. That's the starting point. So just some things to reflect on here. I said I was going to go to 8, but this is, if you know me, I get passionate about this stuff, so I just keep talking. But I like talking about it and sharing about it. So I apologize. I'm so appreciative that you stuck with me this whole time. Um, and for going over time again. But just to sit with these questions as we finish up. So consider these as we wrap up. So, what stands out for you from this teaching? What other questions does this raise for you? And how can you stay curious to develop a deeper understanding about immersion and second language acquisition techniques and language settings? And what are you going to carry forward? What stuck out to you from this teaching? What will you share with others? And how do these understandings shape your own language learning journey? And how can we use this knowledge to create really sustainable spaces for language reclamation for our future, for our people now, but also for our future? So, I just want to say thank you. I totally appreciate every single one of you that joined me for these teach-ins. If this is your first one or if you've been on them for a few times, this is a big passion of our work here at Scott and Goulet. It is the core of why we were founded, is to provide, um, you know, these teachings to our people, to our community, and to really empower them because that empowerment really correlates to wellness, to identity building, to community building. And so I just want to truly thank you all for attending tonight, sticking with me over time, over 8 o'clock. And this is our last teach-in, but we will probably have another session in the spring or in the summer. And if any topic you think of that you want to recommend or suggest to us, we would love to hear from you. So you can email us. I will share this recording with you tomorrow via email. And yeah, just reach out to us on there or on our social media pages. We would love to hear from you. And it's going to be posted on our YouTube channel. So I haven't been paying attention to the chat, so I don't know if anyone put anything in there. It looks like there was a couple in here. Oh yes, yes. Let's see. Um, oh, the graphic. Yeah, awesome. So glad to see you, Leslie. We'll have to catch up soon. Um, let's see. She just said, yeah, multiple opportunities and access points, lots of opportunity and asset-based. For language, language medium is the long game. Definitely, definitely. Generational. We always like to call it like a generational approach to language revitalization. Maybe that is a topic for another teach-in in the future. Understanding a deeper dive into language medium education. Yes, to eventually become normalized for sure. Um, Awesome. Well, thank you so much. I appreciate each and every single one of you. And stay tuned for the email with this recording. So I hope you all have a good night. Onugiba.